Welcome back to Tightwad Workshop. If you're thinking of buying a 20-year-old car trailer, there's a couple of extra expenses you probably should add onto your budget for the purchase. The most obvious one is a new set of tyres. But given the age of the trailer, very likely you're also going to have to replace the wheel bearings. Now, the first way to check for dud wheel bearings is to jack up one corner of the trailer and give the wheel a spin. If you hear any rumbling or grinding noises while the wheel's spinning, that's a pretty good indication that the wheel bearing's gone bad. But even if it passes that test, it doesn't mean you're out of the woods. This is what the wheel bearing on the other side of the trailer looked like. Let's just pop this wheel off so we can do a more thorough test. Now that we're turning the bare hub, it's much easier to feel any stiffness in the bearings. You can see that this hub isn't spinning freely, and it has a clicky feel to it. But unfortunately, I forgot to start the audio recorder, so here's some different audio that describes the problem even better. This will be a messy job, so it's a good idea to use a drop cloth. We'll start by tapping off the grease cap with a hammer. Just work your way around the hub, moving each side a little bit at a time. This one was definitely well lubricated. Now we'll use a rag to get rid of some of that grease so we can see what we're doing. I'll use a screwdriver to bend the end of the cotter pin out, then I can finish the job with some pliers. Sometimes the pin will tap out with a hammer, but usually you'll need to lever it out with your pliers like this. Now we can wipe away the rest of the grease and unscrew the axle nut. This one unscrews in the usual lefty-loosey direction. Next we can use a screwdriver to remove the outer bearing. This has two pieces, the thrust washer and the bearing cone. This bearing doesn't have any visible damage, but it's usually best to replace all the wheel bearings as a set. Now we can pull the hub assembly off the axle and wipe the grease off the axle to inspect it. That axle tip looks good. There's no rust, no scratches and no chips in the surface. If the guy you bought the trailer from told you that he replaced the wheel bearings, then this surface should be clean and shiny. Let's move inside to the workbench. I've run out of workshop paper towel, so today we'll have to improvise. It's a bad idea to mix different kinds of grease in a wheel hub, and since I don't know what type this is, we'll need to remove it all. Be careful using your finger inside the hub like this, it's got a few sharp edges. Now we'll clamp the hub in the bench vise for the next step. We need to remove the bearing and grease seal from the back side of the hub. We'll do that with this hammer and drift. Line the drift up with the inside surface of the bearing and give it a few taps with the hammer. Move the drift from side to side and the old parts should pop straight out. We're not going to reuse this bearing, so it doesn't matter that it landed on the dirty workshop floor. I'll give it a quick wipe with a rag so we can examine it. It doesn't have any obvious physical damage, but I'll be replacing it anyway. The damage to the bearing from the other side of the trailer was a lot more obvious. If we look through the inside of the hub, you can see the inner lip of the bearing cup on the other side, here. We'll use this punch and a hammer to tap it out of the hub bit by bit. You need to work your way around the circle. This won't work if you hammer in the same spot all the time. Once again, we won't be reusing these parts, so landing on the dirty floor doesn't matter. These bigger bearing cups can put up more of a fight, so I usually make things a little easier for myself by running a bead of weld around their inner surface first. When this weld bead cools down from red hot, it contracts and loosens the cup a little bit in the hub. Sometimes they'll fall straight out when you turn the hub over, but usually they just need a few gentle taps from the hammer and punch. Be careful when you pick this one up, it'll probably still be hot enough to burn your skin. Most trailer hubs in Australia will use either Ford or Holden wheel bearings. Specifically, the wheel bearings used in this Ford and this Holden. Sometimes you can guess what kind your trailer uses, but the only reliable way is to disassemble the hub and read the numbers off the old bearings. Once I knew my numbers, I went to the auto parts store and bought 2 sets of replacement bearings. Unfortunately, they only had these 2 sets of my size in stock. The bearings are identical in both packages. The marine version just has a different grease seal and costs a couple of dollars more. This brand also gives you a comprehensive set of instructions on how to install the bearings. Now you can just hammer the new bearings in straight out of the packet, but I like to put the hubs in my workshop oven and the bearings into my freezer first, just to make my life a little easier. Heating the hubs makes them expand a little bit, and cooling the bearing cups makes them shrink a little bit, and together that makes it a little bit easier to get the cups aligned and started into the hub. It's best to use a block of steel like this as a drift when you're tapping the cups into place. Once the cup is flush with the top of the hub, we'll need to use a punch to gradually tap it down to its full depth. Work your way around the circle the same as we did when we were removing the old cups. If you try to hammer one side all the way down, the cup will get stuck and it'll ruin the hub. Once the first cup is seated, we can turn the hub over and fit the second one. This is done the same way as the first one, just with slightly better camera angles. Now we're ready to pack our new bearings with grease. You don't necessarily need high temperature grease for non-brake trailer hubs like these, but it does need to be wheel bearing grease. Don't let the nice blue colour fool you, this stuff smells terrible. Pack the bearings by pushing grease through all the holes and spaces in the bearing cage until you can't fit any more in. This usually takes me 2 or 3 minutes per bearing. It's worthwhile to take a bit longer and do a really thorough job. I usually leave the first bearing safely in the grease tub while I pack the second one. Once the bearings are packed, we need to coat the inside of the hub with a layer of grease. We want to fill the hub up to about 50% full of grease. This forms a reservoir of extra grease that will get used up over the lifetime of the bearing. Once you have enough grease inside the hub, fit the big bearing in place, this way up. Then wipe the excess grease from the seal lip and fit the grease seal. Once again, use a steel block to start it with if you have one. Then tap it gently into place all the way around. Next we can turn the hub over in the vise. Now either wipe your hands or change your gloves. You don't want to get dirt from the outside of the hub into the grease. Now we can grease up the remaining part of the hub that we couldn't reach from the other side. And finally we can fit the small bearing. That's spinning nicely, so let's take the hub outside and refit it to the trailer. Be careful that you don't knock that small bearing out into the dirt. If you do that, you'll have to wash all the contaminated grease out of it and repack it. Now we can refit the thrust washer, then the axle nut. Sometimes it's easiest to turn the nut backwards until you can feel the start of the bolt thread. It's best to use a ring spanner to tighten the nut, if you have one. Now according to our instructions, we next need to tighten the nut while we rotate the hub until we feel a slight binding. I can now feel some of that binding that they were referring to. So referring back to our instructions, we now need to position the spanner at the 2 o'clock position and tighten it to the 3 o'clock position. So here's the spanner at 2 o'clock, now I'll rotate it to 3 o'clock. According to the instructions, we now need to loosen the nut 1 full turn. Then we need to retighten the nut by hand and install the cotter pin. This cotter pin's a snug fit in the hole, so I'll have to tap it in with the hammer. Now I'll use the pliers to bend the end around so it can't pull out again. And we'll tap that over with the hammer as well. The hub still rotates nice and smoothly, so we can go ahead and install the grease cap. These caps just tap into the hub, but they're usually very fiddly to get started. The cap's made of very thin metal, so I'm tapping gently to avoid dinting it. Once that's done, we can refit the wheel, then let the trailer down off our chassis stands. Once the wheel's on the ground, we can give the lug nuts a final tightening. While we have our tub of grease on hand, let's lubricate that tow hitch. Now I could buy a shiny chrome cover for the tow ball, but I'm a traditionalist. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Tightwad Workshop is filmed in front of a shy studio audience.